Hello darlings and welcome back to my channel. My name is Hahn. I'm coming at you today from Vancouver, Canada, and I'm gonna be honest. I was preparing this whole week to make a completely different video. I wanted to make something easy, some silly listicle thing about my favorite opera productions or something. Then my 72-year-old father asked me about queer representation in opera, and I made this video instead. I'm sure I am going to make many videos on this topic, and someday when I have way more time, I can do a deep dive on why it's important to have good LGBTQ representation in opera, but today is not this day. I'm also definitely going to do a video on how to ensure your opera company is a safe and welcoming place for LGBTQ folks to work, create, and exist in, but today is not this day. Both those things are important, vital conversations to have, but I'll be honest, I don't have the spoons for that today. In the last 2 weeks, I moderated a panel on accessibility in opera, had an MRI, and 2 ultrasounds.
Had both my credit and debit cards die on me. For my partner's Christmas present, I decided to do competitions and I recording with my coverage for my crush.
Now we're keeping this short. If you're watching this in the future and I've already made either of those videos, there should be a link in the card above. In the meantime, if you want to see young people express why it's important to see themselves in the media they consume, PBS has a short little video about that I'll link in the description. So here are my top 11 ways to create more and better on-stage representation for LGBTQ+ folks in opera. That's what this video is about. Just that, and nothing else. But I do want to note that these types of on-stage, in-world character representations of queer people in no way replace casting LGBTQ people in operas or hiring them at any stage of the process. You should always be doing that. But casting queer folks, or putting on operas with LGBTQ+ composers or librettists, is not sufficient representation, and it's not enough. The performing arts are well known for attracting LGBTQ+ people. Opera, too, is full of us. It's no secret. It's not news. Nevertheless, we're often stuck playing out the same heteronormative love story over and over again on stage. So here are 11 ways to reimagine operas with a queer twist, and even some suggestions for new works you can commission or support, if you're in a position to do so. Think of this video as a fun little romp through the ways that opera administrators, producers, directors, and composers can make the operas they're putting on more queer. The options are many and varied here. Maybe more so than you think. Now, because there are 2 ways to think about this subject, I'm going to split this video up into those 2 parts. That means the first 6 points on this list will address LGBTQ+ representation in pre-existing operas, in the standard repertoire and beyond. And then the last 5 will go into ways to commission, support, and create new operas with good representation as well. Make sense? Great. Before we start, I wanted to thank all the wonderful and talented LGBTQ+ opera folk who chimed in when I put out the call on social media asking for their thoughts about this. You folks are amazing, and I couldn't have done it without you. Now, if you were looking for a joyful little corner of the internet where we could discuss opera, disability, queerness, cats, and tea, you have found it. If you weren't looking for it, you have found it anyway. So go hit the subscribe button and ring the little bell so you never miss a video. But now, without further ado, and in no particular order, here are my top 11 ways to make your opera more queer. 1. Make your trouser roles women. For those who don't know, trouser roles, pants roles, or travesti roles are those roles in operas where a mezzo, a contralto, or sometimes a soprano, the 3 highest voice types, play male characters. No, I'm not gonna gender voice types in this video. These voice types are what I will call high voices, and tenors, baritones, and basses are what I will call low voices. That's all. Singers playing trouser roles are often in drag to perform them. So many of these roles were originally written for castrati, and time has transformed them so they're now most often played by mezzos. It takes major mental gymnastics and suspension of disbelief just to pretend that their romantic plots are heteronormative in the first place. Why not simply show us some wonderful lesbian stories on stage instead? A wonderful example of this was in Renaissance Opera's 2017 production of Handel's Acis and Galatea, which rewrote the lovers as 2 women looking for a safe space to be together in peace. You can see their preview video from this production linked down in the description. But you don't necessarily need to change pronouns, lyrics, or even small plot points around just to make the strategy work. Changes in the supertitles will often do the trick too. 2. Gender bend romantic roles. I feel like this too is a pretty obvious one, so let's get this one out of the way. The vast majority of opera singers out there have high voices, and yet there are more roles for low voices across the standard repertoire. Give opportunities to amazing sopranos to sing tenor roles. Yes, the other way is great and worth exploring too, but I am biased towards sopranos for obvious reasons. I feel like this is something that the opera world in general has been really reluctant to do, since a lot of people seem really married to the idea that we should leave the music exactly the way it was intended to be performed. But that ignores the long history we already have in opera of tenors playing castrati roles, and therefore changing the octave. So no, changing the octave in which a role is sung is not a new practice. We just have to create new norms about doing it more often. 3. Read between the bar lines. Make characters explicitly queer when their queerness isn't a plot point or the butt of a joke. This includes roles of any size, from lead characters to chorus singers. For example, in Bartlett Sher's production of The Barber of Seville that premiered at the Met in, I think, 2007, there's a scene where Figaro's cart opens up to show two supernumerary women kissing. A supernumerary is an actor on stage in an opera who does not sing at all. They're mute characters, often played by stage actors instead of opera singers. And everyone on the stage treats this as unsurprising. It's lovely. It's never mentioned in the score, but given the context of the scene within the production, makes perfect sense. But Barber is an example of an opera where your production could go even further. I mean, there's nothing in the score that says much of anything about Figaro's orientation. And if you're already leaning into the character having a bit of an entourage and flirting with the people in it, such as in Cher's production, what if he's also flirting with the men too? Figaro does mention in Largo al Factotum that everyone does want him, men and women. And though it's most often played that everyone wants his services, this could easily be a double entendre. This kind of nod to a character's queerness can be casual. And it can give LGBTQ plus audience members the bisexual king we have always been looking for in Figaro. 4. Remember that including trans voices is possible in any role. The opera world is just beginning to realize that trans artists have, of course, been here the whole time. Lucia Lucas famously played Don Giovanni to massive acclaim at Tulsa Opera last year. And yes, she was wonderful, and it's wonderful to see that at a global level. But I think some options for casting trans artists are still being overlooked. For some low-voiced women, for example, even being offered a role that was written for a man, even in a gender-bent production, could trigger some real dysphoria. But the answer is not then to just not cast those artists. So instead of imagining that all trans artists want to sing gender-bent roles, how about this? If you know you're casting a woman with a low voice, rather than taking a part for a man and changing its gender, remember that you can also cast her in a part written for a high voice and have her sing it in her octave. This involves trusting the artist, of course. If this low-voiced woman tells you Cialina is appropriate for her voice if she sings it in her octave, if she sings the arias well in the audition, and if her voice is appropriate for the house, you should have no problem casting her as Cialina. And remember, opera has a long history of giving castrato roles to tenors and switching the octave. Doing so here is not unprecedented. I'm not saying that you should not cast a woman with a low voice in a role written for a man and change their gender. Of course not, if the artist in question is seeking that role. I'm saying that people in positions of power within opera should remember that trans people are not a monolith who all experience their gender in the same way, and therefore those in power in opera should imagine roles for trans artists creatively and complexly as well. 5. Allow for polyamorous happy endings. Some operas, like Così fan tutte, are vague within the score about who ends up with whom. Directors often make that choice, meaning the happy ending of that show varies from production to production. This gives you some liberty to make the ending a little bit more queer. For example, I directed a production of Così fan tutte with Opera Mariposa in 2018, where during the finale, the girls switched partners several times before all 4 characters ended up in what we called a happy cuddle puddle in the center of the stage, with both couples kissing first and then the 2 boys kissing last. The audience loved it. Mariposa didn't have a preview of this production, which I'm sad about, but you can read the Schmopera article about it for more details down below. I'm not telling you to do exactly what I did here, of course, but it's just one example of the many options available to you here, if you look for them. And you should. 6. Support existing LGBTQ plus operas. There are existing operas with LGBTQ plus themes built into the plot, like Rufus Wainwright's Hadrian, or Griffin Candy's delightful Sweets by Kate. Support these productions, mount them if you can, and celebrate existing queer content in opera. It is here, and it does exist. Supporting these productions is telling the opera world that this is the content we want to see, and that if they want diverse audiences, they'll need diversity on stage as well. If you have any more thoughts about how to make existing operatic repertoire more queer, please leave those in comments down below. But now it's time to delve into the world of new works. There's so much freedom here, and I'm only scratching the surface. But let's start with the point that most organically grows out of the last one. 7. Commission and support explicitly queer works by LGBTQ+ composers and librettists. If you are in a position of power within the opera world, have access to funding and some control over programming, consider how starved the LGBTQ+ members of your audience are for representation of queer characters, particularly ones who don't die, or whose stories aren't defined by the bigotry they face. We want to see more content that's simply about life as part of this marginalized community. And so many artists want to make that. Support them in their work. And if you are not in that position of power and know of people or companies making this work, support them by buying tickets. So many companies are still so afraid of programming queer content for fear of what the audience will think. So let's make it clear to them. What the audience thinks is that we need more LGBTQ+ stories on operatic stages. Period. 8. In those works, create roles for all genders and all voice types. This especially means creating parts for women with low voices and men with high voices, and parts that aren't gendered at all. As with point 7, I already know of composers creating this type of work. It's out there. When it premieres, go support it. 9. Create works where romance is not the center of the plot. Romance is not the only strong emotional driving force that a story can have. Disney proved they could do this with movies like Moana and Brave. And if there are any stories that are operatic in scope and emotion, it's Disney movies. 10. Make sure you're creating intersectional, sympathetic representation. As you're writing or supporting the writing of more queer characters in opera, be sure you're creating sympathetic queer characters in that work, rather than those who are the villain or the butt of a joke. We all want to make sure that the representation we have is not just there, it's also good. Think about characters at the intersections of other marginalized groups too. Disabled folks, BIPOC folks, religious minorities, and more. All of that can't really be disentangled when we're looking for good representation for all identities in the work that we do. 11. Make theater that explores sexuality and gender in opera. Opera is not just one thing, and if you are not in a position to commission a new opera, theater about opera can be more budget-friendly for indie opera companies, and is often extremely powerful. But bigger opera companies with bigger budgets can do this too. The Queen and Me, created and performed by Thea Kasahara, for example, discusses the two-dimensionality of Die Königin der Nacht from Die Zauberflöte, the tropes into which female characters in opera are often forced, and ultimately challenges gender norms in opera as a whole, all while they sing their guts out on those arias. I'm gonna link to their trailer for the show in the description below too. And there you have it, my top 11 tips for making sure your next opera production is just a little bit more queer. Look, I'm no academic, and I'm no authority. I'm just one queer person in opera sharing what I'd love to see, and ultimately what I'd love to be a part of creatively as well. If you want to see more of what YouTube has to offer on queer theory, representation, and more, I can't recommend Rowan Ellis's channel highly enough. I realize this video's description is probably getting really long now, but it's worth taking a look through. Now, if you learned something today, or if you like this list and want to see more like it, please like this video down below to let me know. And if you have suggestions of ways to make operas more queer, I would love to hear about them. The more ideas we can gather in one place in the comments, the better. Remember to go hit that subscribe button and ring the little bell. Keep the comment section full of joy and love, and I will see you in my next video. Rufus Wainwright. That's hard to say, actually. Those aren't words.
I liked it.
I have bits of makeup in the wrong places. Don't know how long that's been there.